welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this. And we are going to start with our acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon the land of all of Queensland and Australia that we are upon. And, here it is. And pay respects to the elders of all the communities we are a part of, both past, present and future. And I extend my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today and the stories and cultural heritage that they share with us on a daily basis. And I will now pass over to Craig and Dr. Caroline, and I hope you all enjoy the presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Ashley. I might actually throw quickly to Caroline. Did you just want to, while I get the slides up, do you just want to quickly explain how you and I connected? Because I think that's an interesting part of this story.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to see Craig presenting. I think it was at Museum Next, maybe a couple of years ago now. And for me, the work, this project that Craig was presenting really resonated for me, in part because I'm an academic that kind of bridges museum studies and communications. So I approached Craig out of the blue and asked him if he would be keen to collaborate on writing together a paper about this incredible work that he's been leading at the NMA. And he was open enough to working together. So I felt very lucky. So, but yes, as you'll see, it really is quite some incredible work that the NMA has been doing in this space. And that's now evolved into this research paper.
Amazing. Thank you. Can I just check that everyone can see the slides now?
Yes, we can see it.
Cool. Just because when I put the slides up, I lose all vision. So I'm just talking to my slides for the next little while. So yeah, so thank you again. As Ashley said, my name's Craig Middleton and I'm a senior curator at the National Museum of Australia. And so which is obviously in our nation's capital, Canberra. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional custodians of this place where I'm presenting to you today from. And I'd like to pay and extend my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations person who might be here with us today or indeed watching the recording when it does go online. So let's return our minds, and it shouldn't be too challenging to do this, to the major crisis that we experienced not that long ago, before the one we're technically still living through. And I'm talking about the 2019-2020 bushfire season. As soon as these bushfires began in at least July 2019, staff at the National Museum of Australia began negotiating our roles and the role of the museum through this crisis, and really thinking about how best to document this particular event for present and future generations. And as many of you know, events unfolded quickly, and as the season progressed by mid-November, which is really when the fires were having a significant impact in the part of the country where I am, it was clear that this event was different than those we had experienced before. It was longer, it was hotter, it was drier, and it was arguably, you know, much more dangerous, coming off the back of years of severe drought and the impact of climate change. Now, before I go on with the story of the project we're going to be talking about today, I want to share a memory with you. I recall sitting at home in Canberra on New Year's Eve 2019. The city was engulfed by smoke and a bright orange haze dominated the vista from the balcony of my suburban apartment. So you can see the photo here on the left was a photo that I took not long after I moved to Canberra, actually, in about September 2019. And this photo was from New Year's Eve 2019 on the other side. So the dramatic impact of the view that I was experiencing. So at the same time that I was experiencing this really kind of visceral physical environment, my virtual environment, as I'm sure yours was, no less intense. And so the photos, the videos that were populating my social media feeds were powerful, paralyzing, and prolific. And I remember in this moment having a deep feeling of responsibility, both personally and professionally, to document what I was experiencing, knowing that it wasn't just me experiencing this. So as a good museum professional, I acted and I direct messaged my then head of curatorial through Twitter, both of us being active Twitter users, so it wasn't that random. And we began a conversation about what we being the National Museum might meaningfully do in response to what was going on. And so what this conversation led to was the establishment of a meeting, an internal meeting at the National Museum that all staff were invited to. And ultimately it had three aims. And the first was to ensure that staff were supported during this challenging time. Being in a capital city that is technically a regional city, a lot of our staff were volunteer firefighters. A lot of our staff have properties in regional New South Wales that were directly impacted by fire. And so it was really, we were really conscious that far from being observers, we were actively part of this experience. And so we wanted to make sure that staff felt like they were supported. The second aim was to discuss some of the more practical ways the museum could support impacted people and communities. And just a small example of how we did that, when a lot of communities from the South Coast, which was hit particularly hard, were literally like fleeing and evacuating their towns, they would arrive in Canberra as the closest big city, and they would use the public areas of the museum as a moment of refuge, as a, you know, they would spend hours in the atrium of the museum working out where they were going to get temporary accommodation, and to give their young people space to sort of breathe and be kids while they were dealing with what was going on. And the third aim of this meeting was to discuss collecting, exhibiting and programming opportunities, of course, those being the core kind of responsibilities of a museum. Now, this museum proved particularly successful in bringing a wide range of internal voices together from a range of business units, everyone from IT, curatorial, legal, visitor services, you name it, there was a representative in that room. And for me, what this meeting reinforced was the profound change that was occurring around us, and the very real impact it was having on not only me, but the museum community and also on the nation. And so the question that really remained on my mind was how we, as museum professionals, even begin to document something so complex, something so vast, and something ultimately fleeting by nature. And so emerging from these meetings and these conversations, which did take, you know, these meetings happened weekly for quite a while. What we did decide to do, at least then, was develop a physical exhibition that was dedicated to marking the impact of the bushfire season through the display of objects that we had intended to collect after the season was declared over. And I will get back to that idea of an exhibition soon. But also at these meetings, we talked about how we could use digital technologies or digital engagement and storytelling to connect with Australians who had been impacted by the bushfire event in a more immediate way. And so having decided that the museum would use social media particularly alongside the development of this physical exhibition as a quick and immediate way to communicate with audiences, we launched a Facebook group on the 21st of February 2020. Its name, and I'm missing a slide, but its name was inspired by the first object that we actually acquired, but relating to the bushfire season, and that was the Bungendore Fireys fridge, which I don't really have a lot of time to talk about, but essentially this was a fridge that was put on the side of the road by a family in Bungendore, which is a regional New South Wales town. And they filled it with snacks and cold drinks for firefighters as they drove past into the active fire zones rather. And over the course of that fridge being out on the road for almost 2 months, community members from all over the region were coming, offering donations. They would write messages of support for the firefighters on this fridge, and in return, the firefighters would write messages of thanks on the fridge as well. So it was a really beautiful object, and if you've got time, Google it. You'll find it on the NMA webpage. But this Facebook group, which was called Fridge Door Fire Stories, invited people to share their stories, photos, videos, and so on from the fire event, and ultimately create a national conversation about this bushfire season and the impact it was having. And the image you can see on screen is from a post that I remember quite vividly. It's one I can never forget, really. And it was titled "Our Wall of Safe," and it was accompanied by the words, "We started on the 5th of January. The Sunday after the fire took around 70 properties in our little village and surrounding community. No power, no phones, so no one knew about neighbours, friends, relatives. After a long hug as they entered, everyone who came into the centre was then asked to put their name and that they were safe on a sticky note and tape it to the wall. So many tears of relief were shed in front of the notes in the first couple of weeks as people checked in on each other. It's still there. I never want to take it down." Other users documented their experiences as emergency services volunteers. And so this photo was accompanied by the words, "Sunday, 5th of January, 2020, we were patrolling Tall Timbers Road near Nerriga. The previous day, the fire front had come through this area and crossed the Shoalhaven River. We came across this flag surrounded by burnt and charred bush. The flagpole was scorched, cables in disarray, but the flag still flew, gently fluttering in the breeze. I couldn't resist and had to take a selfie." And there is actually a photo of a selfie of this particular person with this flag. And others documented some of the more unbelievable impacts on communities. And these two photos were accompanied with the very few words, "New Year's Eve on the South Coast, Malua Bay, Mogo and Marua." And some documented how they stayed to protect their homes. These were accompanied by the words, "Two photos of my dad, exhausted after battling successfully to save his property. Sadly, we lost ours. Black summer, comforted by the dog." So in less than 2 months, this Facebook group grew to about 300 members, and group members were sharing stories and personal experiences like the ones I've just shared with you with each other. And they were connecting with each other through comments and likes. And I think that's a really simple thing for me to say, that of course on social media, there's the functionality of comments and likes, but this kind of user to user engagement was something that we at the National Museum don't really see a lot of when we push out our usual marketing material. Our object stories, our sort of core social media content. And so I do think on reflection, we should actually take that as quite an amazing level of engagement when people were connecting with each other. And so ultimately, these people weren't just sharing and telling, but connecting and showing support regardless of their geographic location or the kind of impact that they were having or had experienced. And so the Facebook group in our minds created this space for communities to gather around the bushfire season in quite a meaningful way. Now, as we know, before the bushfire season had ended, the first case of COVID-19 was recorded in Australia on the 25th of January, 2020. And I really, whenever I talk about COVID, I just don't really need to explain what impact it has had on all of us, not least because those impacts are quite complex and differing. But returning to the early days of the pandemic, museum staff noticed a lot. I mean, we are ultimately in the business of noticing things. And so specifically what we noticed at the National Museum was the significant way, again, that Australians were sharing their personal experiences through social media and other online platforms. And at the same time, the public, researchers, journalists, and others were seeking out information from history to make sense of what was happening in their lives. And I'm sure you can guess what I might be referring to here, but the museum had a huge amount of requests for information about the Spanish flu or the influenza pandemic that hit Australia in 1919, almost 100 years before the current pandemic began. And in fact, from the 1st of March 2020 to the 28th of February 2021, the Spanish flu entry on the National Museum of Australia's website received 62,733 page views. But why is that so interesting? Well, for me, it's interesting because it signals that our museums, galleries, libraries, and archives were often the first port of call for this information. And not only that, because that kind of makes sense, but there was an expectation that one, we would have all the answers, two, that we would have associated collections or objects, and that three, current staff could front up to the media and participate in discussions that drew quite complex links between the two events. For me, this demonstrated an important social role for our institutions, and that is sense making. So we supported the public to make sense of what was happening by looking to the past for comparison. So with all this in mind, like our response to the 2019-2020 bushfire season, we turned to social media with the knowledge that Australians were looking to museums for these kinds of opportunities and to make sense of their experiences. So on the 6th of April 2020, only weeks after the Australian government began implementing international travel bans and domestic restrictions, we launched our Facebook group, Bridging the Distance, sharing our COVID-19 pandemic experiences. And so we invited members of the public to share their experiences of the pandemic in real time. So in a similar way to Fridge Door Fire Stories, but rather than asking people to reflect on their experience after the fact, which we needed to do in the context of the bushfires, because we weren't going to ask people to share their stories on social media during a bushfire event, we invited users to share their history of the pandemic as it was happening. And this felt much more responsible and safer because people were often you know, relegated to their home spaces and not working and so on. And we received, again, a range of responses through this page. And I think this particular group got up to almost 3,000 members, if not more. So some people turned to humour to grapple with change plans. And so this photo was accompanied by the words, "I turned 50 years old on Mother's Day. The plan was to be in a hot air balloon over Alice Springs. So instead, in the living room, I set up baskets, helium balloons, printouts of the landscape at Uluru, and off we went. And I'm pleased to report we had a safe landing." Others explained how their home lives had been impacted. "We had the homeschool experience for my daughter with her two little brothers at home. I've also included a photo of my kids waiting outside for my daughter's teacher doing the drive-by Easter hat parade." And others shared of their experience being stopped at closed borders. "After travelling around the West for the last 18 months, we got isolated at Lancelin, WA, about an hour or so north of Perth. We have been here for 7 weeks in the caravan park, virtually on our own. It's clean, fresh air, a beautiful spot, so we have been relatively lucky." Now, the simple fact that Facebook was a platform that was already utilised by the National Museum to connect with audiences, to publish contributions and develop marketing campaigns made the decision to use it as a key channel during the bushfires and COVID relatively easy. And I say relatively. But coupled with the familiarity that our audience have with the platform and the immediate proliferation of personal stories being shared across social media platforms, more generally at the time, staff were comfortable that this platform would provide few barriers to audience participation, at least those who have access to the internet and use these platforms. And while collecting was always a factor within decision-making processes, the use of Facebook was largely regarded as an engagement or outreach tool, an opportunity to create space for sharing, connecting, and supporting multiple publics through the crisis. And so in this case, when we were asking for sort of content and file types, image and video resolutions, pixels, and other factors that might usually inform digital collecting practices, we didn't articulate any of this, and the only, as an expectation of the audiences, but the only restrictions were informed by the platform itself, by the terms and conditions set by Facebook. And so in this way, we kind of understood Facebook as a short-term response to the crisis, and at the same time plan to keep a record of this engagement, for example, through the use of web capture technology. So In sort of summary for the social media part of this story, the National Museum saw social media as an opportunity to do a few things. One was to publicly commit to documenting these moments of profound change in contemporary history. The other was to offer a safe space, relatively safe space, for sharing experiences and connection in times of disconnection and physical distancing. And the third was to connect with members of the public who might not feel like their story was museum worthy if we approach collecting in the usual way. And I think that's a really important point to mention, because museums are these big, scary institutions where we tell big histories. And in fact, the National Museum as a social history museum is much more interested in the everyday experiences. And a lot of the stories that I've shared with you today are very simple and unremarkable, but really interesting and tell us so much about these moments in time. Now, as COVID-19's impact grew in Australia, so we're still in 2020 here, our staff became uncomfortable about staging a physical exhibition that elevated one contemporary crisis over another. And so the team working on this physical exhibition, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, of which I was part, were tasked with deciding how we might create one single engagement that focused on both the bushfire season and the pandemic. So as we reflected on the significance of the digital space in relation to both events, it was collectively decided that an online project, a website project, was a far better approach to public engagement than a physical exhibition. And so no more than 3 months later, Momentous, sharing bushfire and pandemic stories, was launched. Momentous is a digital archive, an online exhibition, and a contemporary collecting project all in one that brings together stories from both the 2019-2020 bushfire season and the COVID-19 global pandemic. Rather than segregating the two events, we bring them together to offer a space for reflection on how we as a nation grapple with and respond to profound change, drawing on deeply personal stories as a vehicle to explore a human response to crisis. In contrast to social media and some of the stuff that I've been sharing with you already, Momentous asks users for more considered reflections, selections of images, and audio and video content. Users give titles to their posts, 50-word descriptions to their images and multimedia content, and can allocate qualities to their stories. For example, hope, sadness, and worry. And I've got a few examples because it's the best way to explain what happened on this site. So some users literally documented their surroundings. This image was accompanied by the title, "Where there's a will, there's a wave." And the caption reads, "A surfer climbs the fence next to a sign reading beach closed during Sydney's first lockdown in April 2020. This image was titled "COVID-19 and the Australian Open 2021. I spotted this spray painted image of a COVID tennis ball on a bollard near Flinders Street Station when visiting Melbourne in April 2021. Not everyone was a fan of Melbourne hosting the Open tennis this year because of the threat of COVID escaping quarantine again." Others shared personal insights into moments of crisis. This one was titled "Yeppoon Bushfire. One Saturday afternoon in 2019, I went outside of my house in Kui Bay, Yeppoon. I looked up and saw this monster. I couldn't fathom what was to happen next." And some shared their experiences on the front line. "A dangerous woman. I'm an endocrinologist and a general physician. Every day I would go to work and return home terrified that I was going to unknowingly transmit COVID-19 to my partner, who was recovering from open heart surgery. I was convinced he would die and it would be my fault." This one was titled "A Long Dirty Day. December 2019 and the unstoppable Greenwater Creek fire comes roaring towards the Blue Mountains from the south. We spend 14 hours hacking, slashing, burning, blacking out and mopping up. At the end, I collapsed into an exhausted sleep in the back of a truck, unable to stay awake." And others shared some of the more everyday experiences that emerged from the crisis. This one was called "Meeting Great Omar. Our twins were born during lockdown when aged care homes were not accepting visitors at all. We brought the twins to meet their 94-year-old great Omar through the glass windows of her aged care home." and this one titled Hospital Visits. Each visit to the hospital for ongoing treatment requires a COVID check at the front door. Our temperature taken, we are given a coloured dot to identify us as safe to enter. Discarded dots collect on the post box outside the hospital. And this is another one of my favourites, because what happened when this was posted is that it inspired a lot of other posts of similar experiences. And so we have a number of photos of this experience of attending healthcare settings and being checked in as okay, and then these dots and stickers collecting on telephone poles and post boxes and bollards. So Momentous not only collects stories, but represents stories back to the public in real time, so that online audiences can read, view, and reflect on these shared experiences, irrespective of their active participation through the submission process. And the site also has a statistics page, which is a really simple way of visualizing the data we have collected through the story submission process. Users provide postcodes, their state and territory, their age, and as already mentioned, allocate qualities to their stories. And so we use that data to create visualizations so people can connect with others of similar experience, maybe from a similar location, or connect with people who from across the country, and they want to know what life was like for those people during this time. And the project resulted in over 300 unique stories that we collected, a diary of recent experiences, and we've stopped collecting now. We've closed off the submission process, and so now it's an archive of experience. How am I going for time? I might stop there, actually, because I've got some other things to say about ethics, which I think can come up in a conversation at the end. And I will now hand over to Caro to continue.
Thanks, Craig. So before I go on, I just want to briefly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm situated here at UQ, the Jaguar and Turrbal people. University of Queensland, and the land that I'm on has long been a space of teaching and learning. Okay, so to continue. So now Craig's provided an overview of the project. I just want to briefly position it within the broader scholarly discourse. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of this work here in this literature was being conducted by our co-author, Lisa Enright, who's not able to join us today. So I'll be presenting what would usually be a good section of this paper, which Lisa would usually present. So I guess the key areas that I'd really like to briefly discuss are the ideas of crisis versus disaster management in the museum sector, and the museum's role, as Craig's sort of touched on, as a sense-making place specifically for a community during a time of crisis. So I'd like to start with the terms crisis and disaster. So as you probably be aware, most museums, and I'm sure libraries, have a document or a process that refers to what an emergency, disaster, or crisis management plan looks like, or they have some variation of the terminology that relates to that. So across the museum sector, surprisingly, there's no universally accepted definition of these terms. It's something that might seem unimportant, but which we'll begin to see has a deep impact on current approaches to the museum sector. In the museum context, disaster and emergency are commonly used interchangeably, but they refer to events of serious and rapid danger to museum collections or repository, and tend to operate with reference to natural events like bushfires, earthquakes, floods, this kind of thing. In particular, the use of the term disaster has directed focus across the sector towards a strong emphasis on the protection of physical, tangible collections in the face of natural catastrophe. And as you can see, that's not really what we're talking about in context of the NMA during this time. So when it comes to the term crisis in the museum sector, again, the term has been used interchangeably with disaster and emergency, and in recent times, this term has been overwhelmingly used when referring to either the threat posed by climate change or the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, again, primarily in relation to physical digital heritage assets. The historical context within these terms, how they've developed in the sector, is embedded in the earlier 20th century, where through the Hague Conventions, the United Nations formally recognized the vulnerability of cultural heritage in terms of armed conflict, and then later in terms of natural catastrophe. And it's in these concepts of serious, rapid, and unexpected danger to physical collections used in these contexts of these two conventions that have shaped the ongoing use and interchangeability of these terms across industry guiding bodies such as UNESCO, ICOM, and AMAG. So the use of the term disaster has directed focus across the sector towards a strong emphasis on the protection of physical, tangible collections in the face of natural catastrophe. A fundamental concept, crisis, as we're referring to it, highlights how an institution takes responsibility for a sudden and disruptive event and the quality of its wider stakeholder engagement as a key component of its management approach. As the 2019-2020 bushfire season highlighted, in times of crisis, there's a need to maintain access to the museum as a safe civic space for sense-making, making it both a public and a philosophical center for a community. What we mean by this is that during times of crisis, museums become not only a place for exhibition, but a platform whereby exhibition can be used to discuss and understand current topics, a place to have difficult and complex discussions and to intellectually and emotionally process traumatic events. So, in order to understand the implications of the use of the term crisis in the way that we're using it in this research and in the way that the NMA were thinking about it during this period, we needed to look to other bodies of literature outside of museology, such as communication or management literature. This literature is broader in its focus and it tends to encompass other aspects of the organization's issue and crisis response. As a fundamental concept then, crisis, as we're referring to it, highlights how an institution takes responsibility for a sudden and disruptive event and the quality of its wider stakeholder engagement as a key component of its management approach. This larger framework for the term crisis leads me to the second area that became a key for the context of this research. This is particularly important with the role of co-creation between museums and the public through platforms like social media and the digital space. For this research, a really telling outcome for us was the realization that although there was a significant amount of scholarly research looking at the impact and use of digital technologies in the museum space, the vast majority of this work centers on the role of digital technologies in mediating relationships between objects, collections, and visitors, most of which is marketing focus. And I guess this is where the disconnect comes, as this sense-making role of museums has been a central theme within museology discourse for decades, and it's recognized as a crucial during periods of increased community stress. So what doesn't seem to exist is how this role is integrated as a key part of risk and continuity planning, something that is currently overlooked in museums' crisis and management literature. So in a theoretical context, crisis management approaches need to look beyond the physicality of collections and the tangible nature of the museum as a space. Digital continuity management and its place in maintaining community resilience is key to the role of the museums in times of crisis as a civil and socially significant space. So then I guess we turn to kind of thinking about our research findings. So again, we'll just give you a few quotes that we collected. So we conducted interviews with museum staff as a part of this process, and we reviewed the Facebook sites, and we reviewed Momentous, and so these were some of the kind of research findings. So as this quote here, which I find is quite telling: "I lost a family farm in the fires. I tried so hard to save it. I tried and I failed. Then I had to get 4 people out who were friends, then my sister, and then 5 dogs. We had to run. We were the last ones out of our district and we had to drive through the fire. I don't know how we made it out and didn't. So then it became quite personal for me in putting Momentous together. I knew I needed to talk about it, but I didn't want to talk about it. So this quite kind of highlights that the people actually working on connecting with, museum audiences are also potentially experiencing the crisis themselves. This was quite an incredible, an impactful sort of finding. So they're dealing with their own trauma while they're dealing with other people's trauma.
And as I mentioned, this is quite a common, like not this particular impact, this is quite a dramatic impact for this particular person, but, you know, it was quite common across the institution that, you know, whether it be a direct impact or a family impact, you know, that we had to really shift the thinking away from being the documenters of history to being active participants in it, which is a shift. And it seems simple to say, but it was a shift.
No, it's really important. Again, this leads off the sort of point that Craig's making here. So NMA staff regarded it as their responsibility to provide access, regardless of whether it was physical or digital. They didn't sort of spend a lot of time differentiating between the two. They just saw it as their role. So here's a great quote from one of the museum professionals we interviewed. Facebook just seemed like a good platform to be able to say to people, hey, we're all struggling with this as much as you are. So here's a space where you can express your views. So it was a way the museum could stay open even when it was closed. So, again, staff really had to kind of think about how they were dealing with what was often quite distressing content. So here's a couple of quotes that I think stand out and really kind of demonstrate that. So you don't want to be flooding people's feeds with negative content. So there has to be a way of moderating it so that you're, not releasing too much distressing content. So really the staff had to think about, and there were a couple of filters in place on Momentous. One was to prevent you had to sort of opt to view a charred cat. And what was the other one, Craig?
Yeah, so essentially what happened was, like, by and large, I think we only used this filter twice, but we received a post on Momentous from the bushfires, and it was charred animals. It wasn't just one animal, it was multiple, but the photo of a burnt cat particularly was quite distressing. And so, you know, thinking about this, and the other one was, it was a COVID post, and it was someone receiving their vaccine, but and I'm sorry if anyone's squeamish, but the needle was in someone's arm. And so it felt like we were looking out for people's aversion to that kind of experience. But what essentially we recognize that the people who might be engaging with this site would have been people who experienced, likely when we're talking about COVID, everybody experienced something. And even with the bushfires, even if there was no direct threat of fire or damage to property, the smoke and the general anxiety that was sort of existing across this nation is just as valid as an experience. And so we really wanted to make sure that when it came to those really graphic depictions of what happened, that we could give them an option. So we essentially created this filter that blurred out the image and put a caution, and wouldn't say a warning, but a caution to say, you know, this is distressing content. This is what we believe is distressing content. So make your choice before you click into it.
And the NMA also had some processes in place to support staff in understanding how to kind of direct people experiencing trauma and distressing content as well.
I can talk about that if you like.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So essentially, we were, you know, through the early days of these Facebook groups, we were, you know, there was a sort of core group of people, myself included, who were, I wouldn't say moderating the posts as a sort of yes, no, but sort of overseeing the content to ensure that one, content was, I suppose, appropriate for a public audience to consume, but also that the people, the users of the posts, there were no kind of red flags. And so when we were sort of understanding that this wasn't only about our responsibility of care for our audiences, it was also our responsibility of care for our staff, who were having to sit there on a daily basis, and in some cases when the posting was quite high, and moving through this content, which was quite traumatic. So what we did is we actually engaged our EAP, our employee assistance program, that the museum's lucky enough to have a subscription for. And rather than using it in the way that it's usually used, which is about you know, human resource issues and people experiencing really horrible things, we decided we had the subscription and we wanted to use it for this purpose. And so we had a few sessions and ongoing conversations with the EAP about how staff could manage a distressing kind of work environment based around this project, when we were having to moderate the content, but also to identify situations through which we might have some concern for the people making the posts. And we worked with those services to ensure that we were never acting as a counsellor, because that is not our role, but we were able to provide the appropriate access to resources and also particular organisations and sort of strategies in terms of how we communicate back to people before we made things live, to ensure that they were aware of what was about to happen. Like, it's one thing sort of writing your experience down in the heat of the moment, and then another thing having a moment of realization through which, oh, actually, no, this is going to be public. This might be more distressing than I anticipated it to be. And so it was a really interesting process. And we did have sort of daily kind of practices, I suppose, in the team to ensure that everybody was okay and communicating about what we were doing and what we were feeling.
And that I suppose that leads us into the next kind of area, which is the sort of ethics involved in kind of collecting and interfacing communities who are dealing with a crisis. So again, this sense that you're considering what you're putting into people's feeds, and this sort of double checking that just because somebody shared something one day doesn't mean that they're necessarily happy to share it later on. So even though Momentous has a release form, you know, that people sign when they contribute, the museum workers that we interviewed really went the extra mile and didn't just assume if they thought something had the potential to be upsetting to the contributor, but often like double check in addition to that waiver that they'd already signed for sharing that. So there was this extra, and there was this extra, the museum workers I spoke to would often kind of go that extra mile in terms of sending something in the post. There were occasions when they'd even sent little gifts to people. So, you know.
Yeah, it was, I don't know, you know, it is something that we were very conscious of, you know, while we as public institutions, and I have no doubt a certain library contexts are the same, in which, you know, when at the point of acquisition, other than intellectual property rights, you want to make sure that the collections that we have are usable. And so we do acquire copyright and permissions all at the point of acquisition, but it's really important in our trauma-informed work, and in many cases in lots of different contexts, that regardless of if we have that permission to use, that we have these existing relationships with people, particularly in the context of a contemporary crisis and contemporary trauma, and that we are going to go back and talk to them about how we might use this content moving forward.
And I suppose that goes into this sort of quote that we've got here again. So again, the staff were thinking about the trauma of the communities that they're dealing with, but they're also thinking about the trauma that each other are experiencing, partly because they may have experienced the crisis themselves, but also because the trauma of working in crisis, working in this sort of ongoing environment. So yeah, that was quite central, I think. So I think some of the other findings we found that Momentous was different to the use of Facebook. So it's more conscious and it involves offering something to a museum in an archival sense, whereas I think Facebook was just so much more intuitive, and just like someone's social media, people know that they're sharing a story, they know that it's going to be archived and kept. So there was this differentiation or an understanding about the different uses of the different environments. I think in particular, partly because Facebook was owned by a third-party platform, so the museum was kind of aware that, like, while it served and correct me if I'm wrong here, Craig, but it served it was useful in the early stages of the crisis for connecting with communities, but it was sort of not ideal in the sense that it wasn't kind of owned and operated by the platform, but the platform wasn't owned and operated by the museum. So Momentous allowed them to create a more sort of stable environment in which to interface communities.
And I think, there's always, I think with any kind of digital project in these contexts, there's always the conversation of, do we go external and get someone to do this for us, or do we create it internally? It's like with the app conversation that people have when they create apps. But I think something important to say is that I don't think we could have acquired so many stories through the Momentous platform without first using the tools that existed, like Facebook, to first do that public commitment and to gather a community of interest who did want to share their stories in this somewhat very public way. And so I kind of understand Momentous as this trajectory, and that if we didn't have this moment of using these third-party platforms, which has existing audiences, account holders and so on, that we might not have reached as many people as we did through Momentous. So it's kind of like one of those stories of building on, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. And look, that goes into this quote we've got here is, maybe we've never been doing it as well as we should until we started doing this, because this is the true direct listening to people's stories and receiving them and protecting them. And I think our collecting regime is laborious and labor intensive. It takes a lot of time, whereas this is an instant medium. This is open to everyone and everything. So
But just on that, just thinking, like, the collecting process are laborious in the federal government and any kind of museum, and I think we're in a moment in time where we're shifting from this notion of material culture to intangible in the digital space. Intangible cultural heritage, of course, is a longer history, but in terms of how we document these events, like COVID, which, the material culture produced around it were really public health campaign messaging and medical type material. But really what we want to know is what life was like, and then how would you capture that? So, and I think that's a barrier in terms of, if a museum can't even think about how to do that properly, or like in a considered way, how would a member of the general public understand their experience being worthy of the museum, whatever that means. And so this was a way to sort of build that kind of opportunity for people with everyday experiences, with unremarkable experiences that were meaningful to them to share. And that's what I understand as a social historian. That's what I understand to be a huge value of this project.
Yeah, I really like the way it creates a push and pull between the institution's ability to collect physical objects as well, in a way that you may not have thought of collecting some of that content had it not been shared through Facebook or Momentous. I think that's really fascinating. So we've talked about this, the way somebody, so it's this ethics of that when somebody uploads something, they might change how they feel about it. So it was those extra levels of ethics and precautions that staff needed to take into account. And that, of course, informed consent is very important. And again, that this kind of notion that's that kind of shifting framework that people are experiencing during a crisis. So some of the key findings are just that management needs to create scope for learning and making mistakes. This environment, I think, you might say prior to the crisis, you know, the NMA worked in a different way using its social media. That'd be fair to say, Craig, and that the crisis kind of pushed different people from different departments together and changed your usual way of engaging with social media.
Absolutely. Yeah, look, we've, you know, I think until that moment, and I hadn't been at the museum for very long, but when this all happened, but, you know, the social media team, and this isn't a negative comment to say the least, but was really in many ways just like a publishing platform. Like they were just republishing content that existed on the website and all that was being produced through the exhibition program. And so this was a really different way to think about, one, how we used social media, how we created content, and yeah, bringing these very unique project teams together that did involve curatorial programming, media comms, you know, governance and legal, if we're talking about copyright, and then our HR business unit, you know, all these, it's a very interesting mix that you don't see very often when you're building an exhibition or you're creating a website, or, you know, so it was a really interesting way of working. And I can say 3 or 4 years later that, you know, the relationship that the curatorial team has with the social media team is much more collaborative than I've ever seen it. So in terms of a sort of organizational progression.
And the situation kind of forced the museum to let go of its kind of strong institutional voice, sort of, because it had to hand it over to the community a bit more. So through that loosening, it kind of enabled more authentic forms of engagement.
Yeah, and it's interesting because at first in the early days of the Facebook, we tried to have the institutional voice be very much part of the conversation. And so we would post, like we would send our photographers out to take some photos, and then we would post them with, you know, a story or a call to action, and they got very little engagement. And so we really had to understand our role as the facilitator of this space and as a listening body rather than a voice that controls the narrative, which is great. It was so interesting.
Yeah, and so important that the community had ownership over that kind of communication for it to maintain that authenticity. And I think the other thing is like that, you know, it had to be kind of timely communication, especially with the use of Facebook in the early stages of the crisis. Like too far after the event was sort of too late. And then that Facebook worked for the initial kind of community engagement, whereas Momentous allowed for a more sort of sustained engagement.
And now remains on our website as an archive of that moment and that experience, and will remain there until potentially we're so distanced from what's just happened or is happening that it's no longer required on the website, I suppose, and then becomes an official record of government.
So other learnings are just that digital approaches really make it possible to collect, just remembering that Momentous is a collection in its own right, and also to support a community during a crisis. And it's quite important for institutions to have digital policies and processes in place before a crisis event occurs. So, for example, now the NMA has built Momentous, it now has an infrastructure that should another crisis event occur, it could reskin that website or use that infrastructure for a different kind of crisis event. So it's thinking about a crisis or a disaster as more than just impacting physical collections.
I love this photo. That's there, the slides done.
So that's about it from us. Thank you for having us.
And of course, we're absolutely happy to answer questions and talk about some of this. I'm sure there are questions.
Thank you so
for
much,
us.
guys. So yeah, I am opening it up to the floor. If any of you guys have questions about the paper, how their research process, how they think it might. Actually, yeah, that's a good question to start us off with. How do you guys think your paper might also affect other people in the GLAMR industry?
Well, I mean, it's been actually quite a joy to write with Caroline because you know, we bring very different perspectives here. One from our sort of disciplinary backgrounds. Like, I'm very much a trained museum curator, museum professional, and Carrie's got this media, PR, media studies, and museums background, arts and culture background. So it really, the first thing to say is that it's really great to work with someone with a different kind of experience than you, because it pushes you both to think differently about the work, which you're very close to in my case. And so I suppose what we hope that, like, our paper and the work that we do together does is not just presented in a way that just sounds like, oh wow, the anime did a great project, good on you, but that actually when you drill down into it, you can actually pull out some of those high level principles and approaches that we took and apply them to different contexts and different types of projects as well. And that's in terms of how, not only how we think of this, one, how we think about digital, right? Not just as, you know, like a Zoom call method of talking to each other, or social media as tools, but actually something bigger and more entwined with identity than that. And then how institutions like museums and galleries and libraries have to really shift their internal processes and their structures and be more flexible with how we've operated, because we really are in this particular moment of change in the digital age, I think, where, you know, 30 years on from the public internet, you know, we have to shift. I don't know if you want to say anything, Caro, about that.
No, I think that really really sums it up actually very nicely, and it has been really beneficial because we do think kind of differently, or come from these different disciplinary backgrounds. But yeah, we're totally in this moment where the digital is interfacing nearly every aspect of our lives.
And look, practically, something that's really interesting that's kind of like unthinking as well is, and I think we were kind of even touching on it in the local government context, is that, you know, often the social media policies that exist are about how staff use it from a sort of public service context, like no harassment, no bullying, no this, but actually it doesn't take it further into how we use it with people, with communities, and with audiences. And so that's a big shift, I think, for people, just to be a bit more critical of those policies from a practical level.
No, I completely agree. And just building upon what you guys have got has been really interesting to see, and how you guys were able to put this together. Out of curiosity, what kind of let's say hurdles or obstacles did you guys find while doing this?
In terms of the project, there are always hurdles. I think there's something to say about crowdsourcing and a fear of institutions that we will be overflowing with public inquiry, that we won't be able to administratively keep up to it. And then how do you say to someone who's experienced trauma that actually their experience may not fit within the collecting policy or the remit of the museum? And so, you know, I think the benefit of the benefit of the impact of the crisis on everybody in the institution made me think that the institution's willingness to undertake this kind of crowdsourced project was greater, because everybody was experiencing something, and they obviously felt a strong commitment to participating in this project, even if they didn't want to share their own experience. So that was still a challenge for some people, particularly our comms and marketing team, actually, because they were also concerned about you know, as a federal government institution, we have to walk a fine line when we talk about climate change and
that supposed neutrality.
Yeah, and so there was a concern that we would get climate activists on these sites, and how would we manage that? And in the context of COVID, you know, how does a museum or any cultural institution collect misinformation without misinforming? You know, misinformation is a real thing, and there were flyers and all this stuff coming out, and so there was a concern that people would be posting this stuff to these sites, and then because of our role as a public institution, then we'd be seen to be sharing this misinformation about COVID conspiracy and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it was about really bringing those concerns and those people who have those concerns along with us, and not just shutting people out and saying, no, this is a great idea, this is meaningful, I want to do this. You can have your big vision, but actually you've got to bring people along. And so doing that hard work to really reconcile the challenges and even mitigate the challenges, which is in part, you know, a great example is how we use the HR service, right? You know, we were mitigating a potential staff challenge in terms of trauma-informed work. And you know, by doing that hard work, we came out with a great outcome, which may not always be the case. But yeah, they were probably some of the biggest hurdles. I think the crowdsourcing one was the scariest.
What also, don't you think, like that sort of shifting up model of curatorial, so that was kind of a bit of a change of
yeah, look, I think curatorial practice is evolving all the time, and I think again, projects like this do challenge some curatorial perspectives on who the expert is and who holds the knowledge and who's responsible for significance. Of course, I'm a trained curator, but I understand my role as a sort of, you know, a relationship builder, a facilitator. You know, I never own the stories that I collect, right? So it's just shifting that focus away from being totally in control of how those stories arrive at the museum and being a bit more open, because, you know, increasingly in a sort of diverse social and sort of cultural context, we actually have to be open to different ways of working. Otherwise, our collections will only speak to a particular group of people, which is the group of people that already come. And so we only work in the way. So that's, I guess that's more of a political disposition in terms of how I understand the practice, but it does challenge the institution. The other thing that challenges curators in this space and institutions generally is this fine line between what the ABC do in terms of sharing digital stories and storytelling, and what a museum's role in that is. And so it's grappling with the idea of like, what is a digital object, and what is like, what are you collecting, and why is that important, and why is it different? Because I believe it is different to, and we believe it's different to what the ABC does when they do digital storytelling.
And that was picked up in some of the interviews. One of the interviewees talked about some of the journalists who arrived straight after the bushfires, and they went up to one of the properties without permission, went right up to get the footage and stuff. And so it was really pronounced in the interview. The museum saw their timelines as being different. I think, just correct me if I've got everything right here, Craig, but my understanding is the museum sent some people to the community. The community was not ready, so they left again, and then left it a significant amount of time before they again returned to visit the community again. So because they're not kind of operating in the same timelines as the media or this context,
the pressure of publishing and getting that information out. And actually, so we not only did happen, we went and they weren't ready and we left, but it was how we connected through into the community. We didn't just arrive, we actually connected with existing, if we had existing relationships, we connected with those. So like when we went to Cobargo, for example, which was a particularly hard hit community, we actually, through our touring exhibitions program, had an existing relationship with the museum manager there, volunteer run museum. And so we connected with her and we had a chat about, you know, like what's the community, how's the community going? Are they ready to see us? And she said, yeah, look, I think we should get you down here, but let's do it. I'll broker you a relationship with the police chief in that town. And so we had a community town hall, and it was, I didn't go myself that round, but a colleague of mine did, and it was particularly challenging conversation, but it was an opportunity for the museum to listen to this community in there. Then we went away, and then we did collect something from Cobargo, but it took months and months and months, and we needed a lot of community buy-in, and because of what happened with the media, and I think we all saw that, and so that was particularly challenging context. But it's how we approached it, which is different to the media necessarily, and I'm not placing value judgment on the media. It's a different context, but it's about how we approach it, the community engagement first, the listening, and the being prepared to connect with communities regardless of if there's an intention to collect or if you might collect anything at all, because those relationships are valuable no matter what.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And as libraries ourselves, we know the importance of relationships with the community and being able to have that give and take with the community. So
Absolutely.
we can definitely appreciate that you guys were being so, I've lost the word, but open to it, I think.
Yeah. And look at, again, it's like we do engagement work, we do community work, but as you all know, every piece of community engagement work is totally different. And so, having that openness and willingness to just go do that hard work, I think is the biggest kind of, the most important thing.
100%. All right. Anyone else have any questions, comments? We'd love to hear them. Please, if you guys want to also put them in the chat, we're happy to read them out and answer them. But please, I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about this. It's all right.
If people want to ask a question later, Kara and I are happy to take email questions through Ashley or Alia, generally. So we'd be happy to talk if you've got burning questions, because often what happens is you sit with something like this.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But we're open to that.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. But yeah, no, I was really excited to see this, because seeing what you guys are doing research wise and knowing what could bloom out of this has been really exciting and interesting. Actually, that sparks a question. What are you guys hoping will bloom out of this? What are you guys hoping the future of this paper and kind of what it might influence?
Maybe, Kara, you want to talk about book?
Oh yeah. Well, Craig and I have just been lucky enough to have our get a book contract with Routledge. So we're looking at collect how museums approach collecting social media. So we're thinking about social media content as an object in its own right, and how we might approach that kind of thing. So the analogy we often use is that Anne Frank used a pen and paper to document her experiences, and now young people in the Ukraine or other places in the world are documenting their experiences of war using TikTok. So we're kind of looking at how museums kind of collect and protect that kind of content, and how they apply the same sort of principles of significance and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's like, Kara and I met in February 2021, and we just started this conversation, which led to the paper, which led to the interviews, which then informed a lot of bigger thinking around this. So in terms of how this is happening, it's happening quite organically in terms of our thinking and our process. And, just through this ongoing engagement around digital outreach, it really signaled to us this, which you kind of know, but you're kind of not sure about how entwined these things are with our communities, and our identities. And so, and I think there's something to say here with a group of people who work in libraries as well, and that we understand that libraries do collect or archive social media. And so we're going to be talking to librarians and others who have done that work, and sort of unpack the different approaches to what a social media archive looks like, as to what a social media as museum object might look like, and what differentiates that, and how we sort of create this space for digital objectivity, I suppose, to exist across our institution. And we know art galleries are already maybe not less on social media, but in the digital art space, in an amazing time-based media space. And so there's lots of connections and sort of thinking to unpack, I suppose, so we all institutions can understand their particular role moving forward.
Yeah, it's really exciting and really interesting to see. And I'd love to see some librarians' takes on this, because I know myself, I'm still relatively new to the library space, so I'm not as experienced with how we've been evolving our collections from not just physical books and physical audiobooks, but those digital ebooks, digital audiobooks, and stuff like that, and seeing how we've had to change not only our how we present them to the public, but how we make them accessible to the public, how we provide feedback from the public, and also like collect that feedback as well, and how we present it. Yeah.
So
Fascinating.
interesting. So complex.
Oh yeah, no, the metadata spreadsheets give me a headache.
Yes. I'm sure you're not the only one.
But yeah, anyone else got any questions? Anything that you want to ask, spark conversation, some thoughts? We'd really love to hear it. Thank you. I'm really happy you guys were able to say yes to this, because this paper sounds so interesting and I'm really looking forward to reading it. The more you guys were talking about it, the more I was sitting in my chair going, I want to read it, I want to read it, I want to read.
And we will share it as soon as it's
Yes.
as soon as it's out.
Thank you for having us. It's been a real privilege to share our research.
Yeah, because it's been really great, because I also really love when different parts of the glamour industry are able to talk to each other, because a lot of our experiences, while different, can reflect on each other quite well, and opening those bridges of communication is always such a great thing, because we all serve the community in our different ways, and we can all work together to be a better cultural space for our communities as well.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. We can all learn from each other.
Exactly. It's always exciting. And I'm really happy with how open you guys are about this paper and the process, because I know it was a lot of work and you guys put in a lot of time and effort, and you guys should be really proud, because it looks amazing.
We are.
Good. Congratulations. But yeah. All right. I'm going to stop talking, because I'm just going to prattle on. Please, anyone else, please come up. Even if you're sharing your final thoughts.
And if anything, as Craig said, if anything comes up, please feel free to, drop an email and we'll respond.
Yes, I'll be, once this ends and my workday finishes, when I get home, I will be sending out an email with you guys' contact information, so they can send emails to you guys, and just a quick roundup of how everything went, so we can all keep in contact with each other and hopefully continue this conversation, because I would really love to see it expand and grow and build into more papers. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Julie. That'd be awesome.
Absolutely.
I know I had a few people email me about seeing you guys present, because they know you guys from previous presentations. This has been really interesting. Yeah.
We're becoming the double act, that's for sure.
Yeah. It was really great. And yeah, I've been reading your previous articles and books, and they're so good and so insightful. So I'm really excited to see this one.
Excellent.
Oh yeah, why don't you guys advertise some of your other projects that you guys are working on? Or, because I know Craig just released a book.
Yeah, well, the book came out in 2020, but yeah, it's relatively new, Queering the Museum, and so that really looks at and I wrote that with Dr. Nikki Sullivan. There is something to say about practitioners working with academics, actually, and being able to share and think together, and then, really creates a capacity for someone like me to be able to publish and work. So, I'm always doing things in collaboration, which is really awesome, because otherwise our projects often don't get the kind of critical attention they might deserve. But yeah, Queering the Museum is really about applying the thinking around queer theory to museum practice towards what we call a queering of the museum, which is really about unpacking assumptions and practices that work to exclude. So it's really about, and it's focused on LGBTIQ plus communities. That's my experience, and that's Nikki's experience. And but it is definitely interesting to read because, again, if you zoom in and zoom out, the core principles that sort of underpin the practice can be applied in lots of different settings, and particularly in settings that relate to marginalized groups as well.
I completely agree. Like, again, being in that community service space, understanding that practices can be evolved / changed depending on what part of that service we're doing, especially for minorities, and providing them those safe spaces within the community is definitely something we can all work on building and working on just having available. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dr. Caroline?
Well, my book is it's called Digital Access of Museums as Platforms. So it looks at the changing shape of cultural institutions and what that means in a digital era. So how we're changing to understand the provision of access to communities as a result of the digital. So that's kind of my most recent book. I have some other work.
It's excellent.
So is yours, Craig. We can have, and I did want to say,
it's why we work well together. No. We just compliment each other.
That's right. It's loving. But it's also really important. He's very humble for academics to work with people like Craig, who bridges the two worlds. But Craig's also an honorary at ANU, so he's very lucky for us to be able to work with people who kind of bridge the two worlds as Craig does, because it means that what we're writing has meaning and it's grounded in industries in which we're trying to make a contribution.
And that's always important.
It really is. So for me, this kind of work, but we can work really closely with somebody who's kind of boots on the field as well. Very important.
Yeah. And it's been really great to see how you guys have been working together and building this, because it's so inspiring and so great to see. And I'm really excited to see it get past the editors and everything and finally get to read it and have my hands on it. I'm sure a lot of others are as well.
Thank you.
All right. Yep. Anyone else before we close this out? Or I think, thank you for sharing, Reese. Well, you're welcome, Emily. Thank you for taking part of this. I'm really happy just how many of you guys came and just how open you all were listening, because I know, ALIA, we sometimes focus just on the library space, but broadening our minds and broadening our relationships with other sections of the GLAMR industry are always important. And I really want to start championing that as we start evolving into these community spaces and evolving into our digital spaces online, so we can help each other and build stronger relationships so we can serve better, I guess. But yeah, but if no one has any burning questions at this present moment, I might let us all go a little bit early so we can go grab coffees, lunch, whatever we want to do.
Coffee sounds good.
Oh yeah, no,
always coffee.
Always coffee.
Yeah.
I think that's the one thing all GLAMR industry really relates to, is just the burning need for coffee constantly.
Totally.
But yeah, again, thank you so much to Dr. Caroline and Craig for presenting this paper, being open to doing this for us at relatively short notice. I know I only reached out to you guys in about February, March about this, and you guys were able to put it together and just be so open to working out a time we could all do this. So yeah, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, the video will be up by the end of the week. I will be sending out an email tonight with the contact information for the both of you and any additional stuff you guys want me to add. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so
Amazing.
much.
Yeah. And yeah,
Real pleasure.
thank you. I'll see you guys later. I'm sorry, I don't know how to end this.
It's fun.
Thank you very
See ya.
Thank you.
much.
Bye.
Yeah, right. Bye.
Mm.